The fork clinked softly against the white plate. It was the only sound between us for a moment. Richard, my husband, placed his silverware down with a slow, deliberate motion. He looked straight into my eyes, his own sparkling with a cruel kind of excitement. We were in the most expensive restaurant in the city, a place he chose to celebrate his company's latest success. But we were not celebrating. He was here to deliver an ending. "Amelia," he said, his voice smooth like honey. "We need to talk about the penthouse." I waited. My heart didn't beat faster. It was strange. It felt like my whole body had gone very still and quiet. "I've been seeing someone," he continued, enjoying the drama. "Her name is Chloe, and I've given her the penthouse. It's a gift." He said it, just like that. The penthouse, the one my grandmother left me, the one I bought with the money from my inheritance. It was my safe place, my fortress of solitude high above the city. He had taken the key to my heart and given it to another woman. He watched my face, waiting for the tears. He expected me to break, to scream, to fall apart right here in front of everyone. But I didn't. I didn't feel sad. I felt nothing. A cold, clear calm washed over me. The part of my brain that feels hurt went to sleep, and another part woke up. It was the part my grandmother had built, the part that saw numbers and facts, not feelings. In my mind, a calculator started running. I did the math. It wasn't always like this. When I first met Richard, he was a storm of energy and charm. I had just lost my grandmother, and my world was gray and silent. He came in like a burst of color. He made me laugh. He held my hand and told me I was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. He was building a tech company and had big dreams. I thought his ambition was exciting. My grandmother had been a businesswoman, sharp and smart, and I thought she would have liked his drive. But I forgot her warnings. "Some men," she used to tell me, stirring her tea, "will see your money before they see your heart. They will see you as a prize, not a partner." Soon after we were married, the small signs began to appear. He would talk about my inheritance and call it our money. When I tried to talk about his company's finances, he would pat my hand. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it," he'd say with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He loved having me on his arm at parties, a quiet, elegant wife, but he never listened to my ideas. He thought I was simple. He thought because I was quiet, I was also weak. He had no idea that my grandmother taught me to play chess when I was 6. She taught me to see the whole board, to think 10 moves ahead. Now, sitting across from him at the dinner table, I could see the whole board clearly. He had made his move. He thought it was checkmate. He thought he had won. I picked up my wine glass, the red liquid swirling inside. I took a slow sip, my eyes never leaving his. His confident smile began to fade. Confusion flickered in his eyes. This was not the reaction he had planned for. He expected a crying wife he could easily dismiss. He did not expect the woman staring back at him now. He was looking for my tears, but all he found was ice. He cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. "Did you hear me, Amelia?" I placed the glass down gently. A small smile touched my lips, but it was not a happy one. It was the smile of a person who knew a secret. "I heard you, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly even. Every single word. He saw something in my eyes then, something that made him shift in his expensive chair. It wasn't the look of a heartbroken woman. It was the look of a new owner. And for the first time, my husband looked truly afraid. I stood up from the table, my movements smooth and unhurried. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate. Richard's face was a mask of confusion. He had expected a storm, but all he got was a quiet breeze. He started to say my name, but I turned and walked away without a word. I didn't look back. The eyes of the other diners felt like little pinpricks on my skin, but I ignored them. I walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, leaving my husband sitting alone in the middle of his failed drama. I didn't go to the large, cold house that Richard and I called home. Instead, I drove to a small, plain building downtown. My driver, a man who had worked for my family for 20 years, didn't ask any questions. He knew where to go. I went up to the third floor and unlocked a door with a simple name on it, A. Sterling. This was my real office, a place Richard didn't even know existed. It was small and simple, with a large wooden desk, shelves full of books on finance and law, and a single framed photograph on the wall. It was my grandmother. I sat down in the leather chair that had once been hers and picked up the phone. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang only once. "Mr. Harrison," I said. "Amelia." His voice was old and kind, but also sharp as a tack. "I was wondering when I would hear from you." He had been my grandmother's lawyer and friend. He knew all her secrets, and now he knew all of mine. "He did it," I said, my voice steady. "He tried to give away the penthouse." I could almost hear him smile on the other end of the line. "Tried is the important word, my dear. He can't give away what was never his to begin with." My grandmother was a genius. She had built a small fortune into an empire, and she taught me how to protect it. "Love is a beautiful thing, Amelia," she had told me a week before my wedding. "But a contract is a beautiful thing too. Never let a man's promises be the only lock on your door." Before I married Richard, Mr. Harrison and I had spent a month preparing. The penthouse wasn't just in my name, it was held in a special legal trust, a fortress of paper that I alone controlled. Richard had signed a prenuptial agreement, a document he barely read. He was so excited by the idea of marrying into money that he didn't pay attention to the details. He didn't see that the agreement was a shield for me, not a prize for him. It stated that everything I owned before our marriage remained mine. Everything. Richard's announcement at dinner wasn't a financial loss, it was a declaration of war. He had shown me that he thought I was a fool. He believed my quietness was stupidity. He had underestimated me, and that was the one mistake my grandmother always said was the most expensive. "He broke the terms of the agreement, Mr. Harrison," I said, looking at my grandmother's picture. Section 7. The clause about trust and respect for personal assets. "He certainly did," the lawyer replied, his voice turning serious and businesslike. "So we proceed as planned. Which account do you want to start with?" I thought for a moment. Richard had several accounts, but there was one he was especially proud of. He called it his personal fun fund. It was where he kept the money for his expensive watches, his fancy cars, and, I now assumed, his gifts for Chloe. It was the account that made him feel powerful. "The Phoenix account," I said. "I want to freeze it." There was a pause, and I heard the soft clicking of a keyboard. Mr. Harrison was a man of action. He didn't waste time with unnecessary questions. He knew the plan we had made for a day just like this, a day I had hoped would never come, but a day I was ready for. "It's done," Mr. Harrison said after a minute. "The account is frozen. He won't be able to take out a single dollar." A feeling of calm settled over me. This wasn't about revenge. This was about balance. Richard had tried to take something from me. Now, I was taking something from him. It was simple math. The first step was complete. The game had just begun, and I had already taken his queen. The next morning, I was drinking coffee in my quiet office when Mr. Harrison called. His voice was light, almost cheerful. "Good morning, Amelia. I thought you'd like to know that someone tried to purchase a $20,000 watch about an hour ago. The transaction was, of course, declined." I pictured Richard at the jewelry store, his face turning from confident to confused, then to angry. He would have made a scene, blaming the bank, his voice loud and demanding. He would never imagine that I was the one who had stopped him. He would think it was a simple mistake, an inconvenience. He had no idea that his world was already starting to shrink. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It tasted like a small victory. But freezing one account was just the first step. It was time to see how deep the rot went. Later that day, I met with Leo. I had known Leo since we were kids in school. He wasn't flashy or charming like Richard. He was quiet, wore glasses, and always looked like he had just rolled out of bed. But Leo was a genius with numbers. He could look at a company's financial records and see the story hidden inside them. He could find a single missing dollar in a mountain of paperwork. He was an expert in finding financial mistakes and hidden money. We met in my secret office, the one with my grandmother's picture on the wall. I had already given him the access codes to Richard's company servers. My grandmother had insisted I get them as a condition of investing a small amount of my own money into his company years ago. Richard had laughed it off, calling it my little hobby. He had no idea what he was really giving me. For hours, Leo and I sat in the dark room, the only light coming from the glowing computer screens. The air was thick with concentration. Leo's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up files and spreadsheets. It was like watching a detective solve a crime. We looked through expense reports, invoices, and bank transfers. At first, everything looked normal. Richard was good at hiding his tracks. Then, Leo stopped. He pointed to the screen. "Here," he said. "Look at this." It was a list of expenses labeled Client Entertainment, but the names of the clients were jewelry stores, expensive designer clothing shops, and five-star hotels. The dates matched the times Richard had told me he was on business trips. He wasn't just buying Chloe gifts, he was using his own company's money to do it. He was stealing from the business he had built, all to impress a woman with things that weren't even his. A wave of disgust washed over me, but I pushed it down. This was not the time for feelings. This was the time for facts. We kept digging, following the money deeper and deeper. The small thefts were just the beginning. As the night wore on, Leo grew very still. He stared at the screen, his face pale. "Amelia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You need to see this." He showed me a transaction for a massive amount of money, a huge loan that had been taken out 6 months ago. The loan was meant to help the company expand, but I had never heard of it. Richard had told me business was booming, that they didn't need any more money. "How did he get this loan?" I asked, my voice tight. A loan this big would need the approval of all the major shareholders. It would need my approval. Leo clicked a few more times and a document appeared on the screen. It was the loan agreement. I scanned down to the last page, the page for signatures. I saw Richard's confident, looping signature, and right below it, I saw mine. Except it wasn't my signature. It was a clumsy fake, an ugly copy of my name. He had forged my signature. He had lied to the bank and used my name to secure a loan that put his entire company and my own investment at risk. My breath caught in my throat. This was more than just cheating. This was more than just stealing from his company. This was a serious crime. He hadn't just broken our marriage. He had broken the law. A cold, hard feeling settled in my chest. It wasn't sadness. It was power. Richard had just handed me the weapon I needed to take everything. The forged signature was a line drawn in the sand. It was the point of no return. Before, Richard was a husband who had cheated and stolen. Now, he was a criminal who had used my name to commit a serious crime. The disgust I felt earlier had burned away, leaving behind something cold and hard as steel. He hadn't just broken my trust. He had handed me the keys to his kingdom. He just didn't know it yet. The next few days were a symphony of quiet chaos, conducted by me from my secret office. Richard's panic started as a low hum and grew into a roar. First, it was his personal accounts. Then, I had Mr. Harrison begin freezing the smaller company accounts, one by one. Like turning off lights in a long hallway, I was slowly plunging his world into darkness. Leo, my financial expert, gave me daily reports. Richard couldn't pay for the company's lunch delivery. A big software subscription was canceled because the payment failed. His company car, a flashy sports car he adored, was almost towed from the parking lot because the lease payment was late. He was like a man in a desert, desperately looking for a drop of water, not knowing I was the one who had turned off the tap. His calls started coming. At first, they were angry. "Amelia, what have you done? This isn't funny. Turn my accounts back on." He would yell into my voicemail. I listened to his messages with no emotion, like a scientist studying a specimen. His anger was predictable. He still thought this was a game, a petty act of revenge from a scorned wife. He thought I was just trying to annoy him. Then the anger turned to pleading. "Amelia, please, we need to talk. I know you're hurt. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. "But you're hurting the company. You're hurting us." He still didn't get it. There was no us anymore. There was only him, and there was me. And I was not hurting. I was building. The massive illegal loan he had taken out was the real problem for him. The first payment was due, and it was a huge amount. With his accounts frozen, he had no way to pay it. The bank was calling him every hour. If he missed the payment, they could start the process of taking over the company's assets. He was trapped. He needed money, and he needed it fast. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the trap I had set. Desperate, Richard decided to sell off small parts of his company. In the business world, this is called selling shares. He was the main owner, but he was willing to sell pieces of his ownership to get quick cash. He put out the word to his rich friends and business contacts that a small percentage of his successful tech company was for sale. What he didn't know was that Mr. Harrison had already been busy. My lawyer had created a dozen small, boring-sounding companies. They had names like Midwest Holdings and Coastal Investments. They seemed like completely separate businesses from all over the country. They had no connection to me, no connection to each other. When Richard offered to sell 5% of his company, a quiet offer came in from Midwest Holdings. Richard, desperate for the money, accepted immediately. He didn't look too closely. A week later, he needed more cash and sold another 3% to a company called Pacific Ventures, then another 5% to Sunrise Equity. He thought he was getting money from many different people. He thought he was still in control, but every time he sold a piece of his company, the money was coming from me. And the ownership was going to me. Leo tracked every transaction, his face lit by the glow of his computer screen. "Another 2% just sold," Leo told me one evening. We were in the office looking at a chart on the wall. It showed the ownership of Richard's company. His piece of the pie was getting smaller and smaller. My piece, hidden behind all those fake company names, was getting bigger. We continued this for 2 weeks. Richard sold piece after piece of his empire, feeling a little bit of relief with each sale, not realizing he was selling the very ground from under his feet. Then one night, Leo turned to me from his computer. He wasn't smiling. He looked serious, almost solemn. "That's it," he said quietly. "The last purchase just went through. We have it." He pointed to the final number on the screen. 51%. I now owned more than half of Richard's company. I was the majority shareholder. It was no longer his company to run. It was mine. The math was done. The calculations were complete. And Richard had no idea that he had just sold his entire future to the one person he thought was too simple to ever understand it. 51%. The number glowed on Leo's screen, but I saw it in my mind's eye as a solid gold key. It was the key to Richard's office, his company, his future. I now owned more than half of his world. It was no longer his. It was mine. The time for quiet, secret moves was over. It was time to walk through the front door. The next morning, I had Mr. Harrison call for an emergency board meeting. The board was a group of serious men who had invested in Richard's company. They helped make the big decisions. The reason for the meeting was simple and vague. An urgent review of company leadership and financial stability. It was a message designed to cause worry, to make them all wonder what was wrong. It would make Richard think the bank was coming for him because of the loan. He would walk into that room ready for a fight, but he would be fighting the wrong enemy. I arrived at the company headquarters an hour before the meeting. The building was all glass and steel, a monument to Richard's ego. I had only been here a few times, always on Richard's arm for a party. Today, I walked in alone. I went straight to the main conference room on the top floor. It was like a glass box in the sky, with a view of the entire city. Richard's throne room. I sat down in the large leather chair at the head of the long, polished table. The chair was still warm. He must have been sitting here this morning, worrying. One by one, the other board members arrived. They were older men in expensive suits. They looked at me with surprise. They knew me as Richard's quiet wife, not as a businesswoman. I simply nodded at them, my hands resting calmly on the table. Then, Richard burst in. His hair was a mess, and his face was pale with stress. He was holding his phone and looked angry. He saw the serious faces of the board members, and then he saw me. He stopped. He stared at me, sitting in his chair, at the head of his table. "Amelia?" he said, his voice a mix of shock and anger. "What is this? What are you doing here? This is a private meeting." I didn't answer. I looked at Mr. Harrison, who stood at the side of the room holding a folder. "The meeting can now begin," Mr. Harrison said in his calm, legal voice. "We are here to discuss a recent major change in the ownership of this company." Richard looked confused. "What change?" "I haven't sold any more shares." "Actually, you have," Mr. Harrison said. He began to list the names of the shell companies I had created. Midwest Holdings, Pacific Ventures, Sunrise Equity. Over the past 2 weeks, these companies have purchased a significant number of shares. As of last night, they have acquired a controlling interest. Richard's face went from confused to terrified. He knew what that meant. "Who are they?" he demanded. "Who is behind this?" I decided it was time for me to speak. I leaned forward slightly. "I am," I said. My voice was quiet, but it filled the silent room. "All of those companies belong to me. I am the majority shareholder now, Richard." The color drained from his face. He looked like he had been punched. The other board members gasped and started whispering to each other. "But that's not the only reason we are here," I continued, my voice as cold and hard as the glass walls around us. I nodded to Leo, who was standing by a large screen. An image appeared for everyone to see. It was the list of expenses for jewelry and 5-star hotels, all paid for with company money. Richard's face turned red with shame. "And then," I said, my voice dropping lower, "there is the matter of the loan." The screen changed. It showed the loan agreement for millions of dollars, and at the bottom it showed 2 signatures, Richard's and the clumsy, ugly forgery of my name. A wave of shock went through the room. This was not just cheating on a wife. This was a crime. This was fraud. The board members, who only minutes ago were Richard's friends and partners, now looked at him with disgust. They were businessmen. They saw a man who had lied, stolen, and put their entire investment at risk. Mr. Harrison let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "I believe a vote is in order," he said. "A vote to remove Richard as CEO, effective immediately." The vote was quick. Every hand went up. Richard just stood there, his mouth open, his whole world crumbling around him. "And a vote for a new CEO," Mr. Harrison continued. "I nominate Amelia." As the majority owner, my vote was the only one that mattered. But one by one, the other hands went up too. They knew I had just saved them. The meeting was over. Richard looked at me, his eyes begging. He had nothing left, no power, no anger, just defeat. "Security will show you out," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. I watched as 2 guards came in and gently led my husband, the man who thought he was a king, out of his own castle. I was now sitting on the throne. After the guards led Richard away, a heavy silence fell over the conference room. The board members looked at me, their faces a mixture of shock, respect, and fear. They had known me for years as the quiet wife who smiled politely at company dinners. They were now looking at the woman who had just taken down their CEO with the precision of a surgeon. They were wondering what I would do next. I didn't waste a moment. I turned to Leo, who was already pulling up new files on the main screen. "Leo," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I want a complete breakdown of all company debts and outstanding payments. I want to know exactly how much money Richard has stolen." Then I looked at the board members. "Mr. Harrison will be leading a full, independent audit of the last 5 years. We will find every dollar that is missing. We will be transparent, and we will fix this." For the next week, I lived in that office. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a cold sense of purpose. The company was a mess. Richard had been using it like his personal piggy bank for years. He had taken out other, smaller loans, made risky deals, and promised things to clients that the company couldn't deliver. He was like a child who had built a tower of blocks that was about to fall over. I was there to stop it from crashing completely. I worked with the engineers, the accountants, and the project managers. I listened to them. I learned the business from the inside out, not from the top down. The employees, who had been afraid of Richard's temper, started to relax. They saw that I was there to work, not to yell. But there was one last piece of the puzzle to deal with. One last mess to clean up. The penthouse, my home. While I was rebuilding the company, Chloe was living in my apartment. I could picture her there, walking on my rugs, sleeping in my bed. She was a ghost in my life, a symbol of Richard's disrespect. But I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a need to put things back in their proper place. I didn't go there myself. That would be emotional and messy. Instead, I had Mr. Harrison draw up a formal legal notice. It was a cold, official document that stated I was the sole owner of the property through a private trust and that she was trespassing. It gave her 48 hours to leave. A professional process server, a man with a blank face and no emotions, delivered it to her. I can imagine her world falling apart. It probably started a few days after Richard was fired. She would have gone to her favorite designer store on Fifth Avenue, ready to buy a new handbag. She would have handed over the shiny black credit card Richard had given her, and the cashier would have handed it back with a polite, pitying smile. "I'm sorry, this card has been declined." She would have tried another card. Declined. She would have called Richard, her voice frantic. But his phone would go straight to voicemail. Her texts, once answered in seconds, would now be met with silence. The man who had promised her a life of luxury had simply vanished. Then, the doorbell would ring. The man with the blank face would hand her the envelope. She would have torn it open, her hands shaking. She would read the legal words. Not understanding all of them, but understanding the most important part. She had to get out. The penthouse was never a gift. It was a lie. She wasn't the new queen of the castle. She was just a temporary visitor who had overstayed her welcome. The notice also mentioned that all assets purchased with stolen company funds could be seized. That would have been the final nail in the coffin. The designer clothes, the jewelry, the very shoes on her feet, they were all evidence. A smart girl like Chloe, who had built her life on finding rich men, would know when the game was over. She would know that staying meant risking legal trouble. 2 days later, Mr. Harrison called me. "The penthouse is empty," he said. "The doorman saw her leave last night with 2 large suitcases. She left the keys on the kitchen counter." Just like that. She was gone. She had vanished as quickly as she had appeared. Chloe was never the real problem. She was just a symptom of Richard's disease of greed and arrogance. She was a loose end, and she had just tied herself up. Now, there was only one thing left to do. It was time to have the final word with Richard. With the company secured and the board aligned, the real work began. The next few weeks were a blur of long days and longer nights. I moved into the CEO's office, but I had the big, intimidating desk Richard had loved so much removed. I replaced it with a simple, functional table where my team and I could gather around, spreading out papers and looking at plans together. The atmosphere in the building began to change. The fear that had always lingered in the air when Richard was there slowly disappeared. It was replaced by a quiet, focused energy. I discovered that the company was filled with brilliant people who had been too scared to share their best ideas. I listened to them, and together, we started to put the pieces back together. We untangled the bad deals Richard had made. We called the clients he had lied to and offered them honest solutions. We started paying back the debts he had hidden. Slowly, like a ship turning in the water, the company began to move in the right direction. I found that I loved the work. My grandmother had always told me I had a good mind for business, but I had let Richard's shadow cover my own light. Now, there was no shadow. There was only the work, and the satisfying feeling of building something real and honest. But there was one last piece of business that had nothing to do with spreadsheets or contracts. It was the penthouse. My home. While I was working to save the company, Chloe was still living there. I knew she was. The doorman, loyal to my family for years, gave me daily reports. She was having packages delivered, friends over. She was living the life Richard had promised her, completely unaware that the man who paid for it all had nothing left. I felt no anger towards her. Anger was a messy, useless emotion. Chloe was not the enemy. She was a symptom. She was a line item on a long list of Richard's mistakes. She was a loose end that needed to be tied up. I would not go there myself. I would not give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. This was not a drama. This was a legal procedure. I asked Mr. Harrison to handle it. He drafted a formal eviction notice. It was cold, legal, and final. It stated that I was the legal owner of the property and that she was trespassing. It gave her 48 hours to vacate the premises. It also included a very important clause. Any items in her possession that were found to be purchased with stolen company funds were subject to seizure. That meant the jewelry, the designer clothes, the expensive art she had probably hung on my walls. All of it could be taken. I imagined the moment the notice arrived. She would be enjoying a cup of coffee, looking out at the city from my window. The doorbell would ring. A man in a suit would hand her an envelope. Her world, which had already started to shrink when Richard's credit cards were declined and his calls stopped, would collapse completely. She was a smart girl in her own way. She knew how to survive. She would understand that the dream was over. Staying would mean facing lawyers and possibly the police. Running was her only option. 2 days later, the call came. It was Mr. Harrison. "It's done," he said, his voice calm. The doorman confirmed she left late last night. She took 2 suitcases and a taxi to the airport. The keys were on the counter. The apartment is empty. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. Another line item crossed off the list. Another problem solved. The board was clean. All the pieces were back in their proper places. All except one. And I knew sooner or later he would come to me. It was time for the final move. It was a week later when he found me. I was at the Penthouse. I had spent the day not as a CEO, but as myself. I had opened all the windows, letting the fresh air chase away the last ghosts of Richard and Chloe. I had replaced the flowers, put my own books back on the shelves, and sat in my favorite armchair, watching the sun set over the city. My city, my home. The doorbell rang, and I knew it was him. I had told the doorman to let him up if he came. I opened the door. The man standing in the hallway was a stranger. He wore Richard's face, but everything else was gone. The expensive suit was replaced by wrinkled clothes. The confident, arrogant smile was gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate look in his eyes. He had lost weight. He looked tired and broken. He looked like a man who had lost everything, because he had. He just stared at me for a moment, as if he couldn't believe I was real. "Amelia," he whispered. His voice was rough. I stepped aside and let him in. I didn't offer him a drink. I didn't ask him to sit down. I just waited. He walked into the middle of the living room, my living room, and looked around. He saw that all traces of his betrayal had been erased. It was as if Chloe had never been here. It was as if he had never been here. He turned to face me, his hands hanging limply at his sides. "Why?" he asked. It was the only word he had left. It was a child's question. I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the monster who had betrayed me. I saw a small, weak man who had been so blinded by his own greed that he couldn't see the cliff he was running towards. "You're asking the wrong question, Richard," I said, my voice soft but firm. "You shouldn't be asking why I did this. You should be asking why you thought I wouldn't." He shook his head, confused. "I loved you," he said, but the words sounded empty, like a line he had forgotten the meaning of. "No," I replied, taking a step closer. "You didn't love me. You loved the idea of me. You loved my money, my family name, my quietness. You thought my quietness was weakness. You thought my kindness was stupidity. You saw me as a beautiful painting to hang on your wall, not a partner to stand beside you. You never once saw me for who I truly am." Tears started to well up in his eyes. They were real tears this time, tears of self-pity. "I lost everything," he choked out. I gave a small, sad nod. "Yes, you did, and you lost it all on the night you sat at that dinner table and looked me in the eye. The moment you told me you had given my home to another woman, you didn't just break my heart. You gave me a problem to solve. When you looked at me, you expected to see tears, but you didn't. Do you know why, Richard? Because you weren't worth my tears. You were just a math problem, a complicated one, I'll admit, but a problem with a solution. He finally understood. He saw the truth in my eyes. He saw the woman his grandmother had raised, the woman he had been too arrogant to ever see. He had nothing left to say. There were no more lies, no more excuses. He turned and walked out of my home and out of my life, forever. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I felt quiet. The storm was over. I walked to the large window and looked out at the city lights twinkling below. The world was vast and full of possibilities. I had taken back my home, my company, my life. I had done the math. And now, I was finally free.